Jim, I want to ask you just a couple of things about your time as president of the State Bar. We have behind us your famous State Bar president
That is
picture,
me.
just to put you in the mood, put you back in the moment. And so we're 1989, roughly. You're president of the State Bar of Georgia. And I really just wanted to ask one thing, and that was, during your time in leadership, what were the things that you were most proud of that you did or accomplished?
Well, I'll even start it off sort of in a negative way, is one of the things I was most interested in was our disciplinary system, which at that time took about 3 years on the average to get a disciplinary case moved forward. And I had all these great ideas. And it was one of the few times, I'll acknowledge, that I totally misread a political situation that I'd always had as my guideline: you don't ever ask for the vote before you know what the vote is. Well, this time I didn't, and we didn't get a lot of my changes through that I would have liked to have made, and the procedural aspects of discipline. So that's one that I wish had happened.
Now that's a document still known as the Elliott Plan. I've seen that document.
Well, that came actually even later. That was in, I guess, sort of the early 90s. Interesting group, half lawyers, half non-lawyers, and had really radical suggestions like that the burden of proof should no longer be beyond a reasonable doubt, which meant you could never prove a disciplinary case if the lawyer denied it, and a few other things like that. And that was the only one, by the way, is the burden of proof that got changed out of all of our brilliant recommendations, though over time a number of them have taken place. Other things I was interested in at the time had become seriously concerned about substance abuse among lawyers, because of the fact that lawyers and doctors have an incidence of substance abuse more than twice the average of normal people, over 20%. So I even tell my students now, look to your right and left, it's no longer 1 out of 3, but of the 5 of you, 1 of you will have a substance abuse problem during your practice. So I thought it was something serious. It was something that people tended to laugh about in a nervous laughter, but it was a real issue, and fortunately we were able to beef up. We had Henry Troutman, we had other folks on the staff of the bar who dealt with substance abuse very effectively. And I think we have seen that still needs to be there. It's no longer as emphasized in the same way. But that was something I thought was important. And I guess something else that was, you have an opportunity to do some things that the first African-American woman on the Board of Governors, I believe the first African-American male on the Board of Governors, and maybe even, if not the first, one of the first women on the Board of Governors. I got there because I had the ability to appoint them to fill unexpired terms of folks who had left. So we began to add a little diversity to the board.
This is the late 1980s,
Yeah.
and that had never happened before.
Never. Well, think about it. The composition of the bar, as I say, until the early 70s, there were not many women in law school. Mm-hmm. So that people on the Board of Governors would tend to have been people who had been in practice, 20 years or more in their local community before they would be elected to be there. So there was going to be a time lag, and this just speeded it up just a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the bar was changing very much in its own composition, and it needed to be recognized in the composition of the Board of Governors.
It was time.
Yeah.
Well, the time came when you decided to leave Alstonburg, leave the practice entirely, and you went to Emory.
Right.
Tell us about that decision to leave the practice. How did that come about?
Well, It actually was, the catalyst was probably a cardiologist who had given me some, really foolish advice about how if I didn't change what I was doing, that our next appointment was going to be at H.M. Patterson and Sons, which most folks know is a mortuary on Spring Street. And of course, I didn't pay any attention. I mean, what does he know? He's just a doctor, right? And so I'm coming through LaGuardia Airport with a heavy bag of documents and a bag over my shoulder and start having chest pains. And since I'd already gone through 1 heart attack and 2 angioplasties, I thought maybe Joe knows what the hell he's talking about. Mm-hmm. So that had a lot to do with my deciding, okay, it's time to go do something else.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one thing to decide to leave the practice, and it's another thing to begin a new career. How did it come about so that you joined the Emory faculty?
Well, when I decided that at the end of the year I was going to leave, I had no idea what I was going to go do. I had taught 10 years as an adjunct, and so the then dean knew he was not taking any real risk on that, in that sometimes there would be 120 people on the waiting list for the class, so it was, must be doing a pretty reasonable job on it. Mm-hmm. I didn't find out about it until sometime later. A friend who was a trustee called a friend who was the president of the university, who called the dean to say, did you realize he's leaving private practice? And of course the dean said no, and he said, don't miss this opportunity. So I get a call from Woody, who I'm saying, how did you know I was?
This is the dean.
Yeah, the dean, saying we'd love for you to come out here and teach. And I didn't know that he had gotten encouragement. I thought he was just showing incomparably good judgment in stepping forward. Okay. But I went out there.
Right. And you've been there ever since?
Been there, I guess, about 18 years now.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk with you a little bit more about your impression of legal education, and because you come at it from a very different perspective. But before we do that, I mean, really, a lot during the same time period, there was something else going on in Georgia, and it was the professionalism movement, and you've been involved in that really from the beginning,
right,
and in particular with the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. Could you talk a little bit about the commission and what it has meant to Georgia and to the nation, for that matter?
Yeah, I think the commission has been important. We knew from the very beginning that there was not going to be any real data so that you could say, okay, before we were formed, 78% of Georgia lawyers were professional, and now because of us, 92% are professional. We were never going to have that sort of empirical data, but we were convinced that having lawyers focus on professionalism, something several notches above just ethical conduct, but professionalism. And you're going to hear all the same names about how this comes about. That, I'm sitting in my office, I get a call from a guy named John Ingersoll, who is Jim Laney's assistant. Jim Laney's the president of Emory, to say, can I come talk with you? And I said, well, sure, John, but I've already given this year. Graduate of a private school realizes that whenever somebody calls, it's generally because they get a pledge card. And John says, no, Dr. Laney and Justice Marshall and Justice Weltner wanted me to come see you. And I say no at that point. So the three of them had been talking about professionalism, that Jim Laney had been the T-School dean, theology school, before he had been president of Emory, and one of his major things was ethics in the professions. Mm-hmm. They said, we want to have a convocation, and the three of them decided that you were the one to set up the guest list. So I rounded up the usual suspects, and we had a convocation at Emory, and the determination was that there ought to be an organization that really paid attention to this. Sat around with the three folks from the court, decided not to make it a committee of the bar, because the bar is like every other volunteer group. You've got somebody who comes in, they're president for a year, they want to do something new and different, and we didn't want this to have an ebb and flow, so it was set up under the Supreme Court. And I think it's had a real impact. Frightening thing is, I'm the last one of the founders who's still around. But each of the successive Chief Justices has really taken it as a personal thing. It's called the Chief Justices Commission. It's been copied by, I don't know, maybe 20 other states. So we've had a real impact. And it's what gave rise to the ethics and professionalism requirements of CLE. So I think it's had a good impact on the bar.
You know, when I had the chance to visit with Justice Clark, I asked him about this, and he gave you credit for finding the way to fund it, in part, of course, through CLE. So I wanted to make sure you knew that he had given you your due for that.
That was nice. The consummate gentleman, Harold.
There was additional funding, of course, that came through another one of your friends, Judge Hugh Lawson. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about?
All right. See, it just seems like we're focusing on Middle Georgia. I mean, here's Hugh in the Middle District. Actually, the case, the DuPont case, had been J. Robert Elliott's before he got turned over to Hugh. There was a, shall we say, an issue dealing with discovery, which Judge Elliott, as I recall, issued a $106 million fine. I forgot what. In any event, it got assigned to Hugh Lawson. And Hugh came up, Judge Lawson came up with, I thought, a real smart move. Instead of fining the people involved and paying that money into the registry of the court, meaning it would get absorbed into the budget of the government of the United States, where it wouldn't do very much. He decided, okay, at that time there were 4 accredited law schools. And he took $10 million of the fine and required that be divvied up among the 4 schools for very prestigious chairs, one of which you hold. So he was using the money here to deal with the issue that he had had before him. Another major part of the money was used on a rotating basis for programs to be put on by each of the 4 schools for practicing lawyers and judges dealing with ethics and professionalism. And again, I thought that was just such a smart way to take money and use it for a really good purpose.
And there was additional money that went to the commission.
Yes. Though I can't remember how much it was, but it was in 6 figures, at least well into 6 figures. So all of that helped.
Well, let me go back to your academic side.
Okay.
You've been there now many years, teaching with all of this background as a practitioner. What's the best way to put this? The biggest rewards and the biggest challenges you see as an academic now after having been in practice for all those years?
All right, those are easy. The biggest rewards are dealing with students, teaching. I absolutely love it. Biggest challenge is the faculty. Lord knows. Being in the academy and still thinking like a practicing lawyer is really an odd situation. As an example, an academic would define productivity as
Articles published.
How many articles have you published? I think of productivity as how many students have you taught? The difference being one of those brings in all of the gross revenue for the school, the other brings in none of the gross revenue of the school. And yet academics put the one that brings in no revenue as being the most important thing that they do. And I guess there was a recent study that I will, of course, claim vindicates my view in that these numbers are not going to be absolutely right, but that 80% of all law review articles are cited 3 or fewer times. Only something like 2% of law review articles are cited 10 or more times, or maybe 20 or more times. And I think that says about all you need to say. I think teaching is our primary focus as part of a research institution, as most of the schools are. There is clearly going to be a scholarship element in there. They are now grossly imbalanced. Your school, my school, every other school is going to say that scholarship and teaching are equally important to decisions on tenure. Ain't so. You can have very poor student evaluations of your teaching and still get tenure. You're not going to get tenure if you don't get good evaluations on your scholarship. Mm-hmm. You know, it's out of balance. And in fact, one of the things that, if I'd had better judgment, the first faculty meeting I went to 18 years ago, the topic is tenure and the requirement of community service. And fierce discussion over whether service on a university committee would be community service or should it only be service on a law school committee. And the intemperate one says, there's a community outside the law school. Why don't we think about that? And so poor Woody the dean makes the bad judgment of saying, well, what is your view of tenure? And I said, well, it's a concept whose time has long since passed. And that was greeted with rousing enthusiasm, as you can imagine, meaning utter silence for about 10 seconds until he grabs the agenda and goes to the next agenda item.
Next item.
And I'm sure that that view would be no more popular here, but I really think that tenure is inappropriate. Federal judges have it, but there's this old piece of paper from around 1789 or so that gives them that. And I will tell you, for those of us who lived through the 60s, the judicial independence of the federal judiciary was critical.
I thought academic tenure was in the Constitution. Is it not?
It probably, for most, would consider it to be, or would assume that the copy they have is a misprint because it's not included. No, and that's clearly not a very popular view in the academy, though, believe it or not, I had any number of people come by in the next 24 hours saying, I don't think I would have said that in public, but I agree. And I said, would you give up your tenure? Oh, no, I've got But in the future, I don't see why we keep doing this. Right.
Well, let's talk about the future for a few minutes. I'm going to open this up for questions from our audience in a few minutes, but these are turbulent times in the legal profession and in legal education, and I want to take the profession first. Looking down the road from the perspective that you've got of having been in the profession for a long time, as you look 5, 10, 20 years out, what do you hope for? What do you fear? What do you expect?
Well, what I hope for is that we continue an emphasis on this as being a profession, hopefully being a profession of service. I would hope that we will find a way. We'll never solve the need for legal services for all people, but at this point we're graduating 40% more people than there are legal jobs. And yet there's a huge need for legal services. I wish there were some way to put those together. Unfortunately, I have not come up with that way. Wish I had. In terms of the practice of law, I think there will be some fairly significant changes, at least in part. That the business model for most law firms that has existed for the last 40 years is that you bring in these brand new, just graduated, just passed the bar young lawyers. You love to have them because if you can work them for 2,000 billable hours and bill those hours at $200, $250 an hour, that's $400,000, $500,000 in gross revenue. I could pay them $150 and $50 for perks and an allocation of overhead and still make a real profit. Every one of them is a profit center. When clients, as they have been doing increasingly and with a rapid increase in the last 3 or 4 years, have started saying to law firms, I'm not going to pay for lawyers who have fewer than 4 years in practice because I'm not going to pay for you to train your lawyers to be lawyers. All of a sudden, I can still bill you 2,000 hours, but I can't charge for it. You are now a cost. You are no longer an asset, you're a liability. And that has a tremendous impact on people who are in law school, people who just graduated from law school. We are all telling our third years, now you need to get 3 years of experience. And they're saying, yeah, sounds good, how? Fortunately, more than half are getting legal jobs, but that means a lot of them are not. Which is a segue into legal education, and that is, we've all heard about the Carnegie report. Most of us have read at least the executive summary. I have to concede that I tried to plow through the whole thing and went back to the executive summary. But what the Carnegie report said in shorthand is that you do a great job teaching students analytical thinking, meaning those courses they take in their first 3 semesters, the current faculty does a really good job at doing that. Something that bothers me, and I suspect you, is that we do not do a very good job in teaching values. Third thing we don't do, and this is no shocking news, the McCrate report said it 20 years before and was ignored. We do a terrible job teaching skills. And in part, that's because many academics don't see that as a part of the mission of a law school. The old thing about we teach our students to think like lawyers. And again, the heretic steps up and says, well, 1, we don't even do that. We teach them to think like law students. But 2, when you go to the ATL, do you want a flight crew that thinks like pilots or people who know how to fly the damned airplane? And I think clients are the same way. They're not expecting trainees. When they come in and pay very high hourly rates, they want somebody who knows what they're doing. So what I see there is for many schools, there will be 2 tracks for faculty. There will be the traditional track that will be emphasized during the first 3 semesters. There will be a second track that will be composed primarily of adjuncts who will be teaching skills. Law schools are not the equivalent of a graduate school of arts and sciences, in my view. Not shared by a lot of people, by the way. It's a professional school, just as medical school is, just as theology school is. We need to be teaching how to practice law. I think you and I agree that in 3 years of law school is not going to turn out a practice-ready person. But we can do a well of a lot better than we have for the last 40 years. And what's pressuring us to do that is the fact that the business model for folks who hire our graduates is changing, and that they don't any longer want somebody who's bright and trainable, that they can train. They want somebody who is bright and has been trained so they can bill them. So I think we will see some significant differences and maybe some fallouts that we may not have 201 accredited law schools 5 or 10 years from now.
Times are changing.
Times are changing, and we need to change with it.
Yep. Well, Jim, let me turn this over to see if we have any questions from the audience. We do have some students with us, and of course, your guests. And what questions might we have? Yes, ma'am.
You played a principal role in the founding of Georgia Legal Services, but now, many years later, a lot of poor people still don't have access to lawyers. What should our generation be doing to see that people who need this access are getting it?
A wonderful question. I really do believe that by becoming a lawyer, you take on obligations other than to make money. And the nice thing is you can do good while you do well. That you can learn to practice law, but you can also allocate some of your time to helping those folks who really need that help. Whether it's a Saturday lawyer program, whether it's actually going to work with legal services operations. At some point it might even be writing nice checks to help support that sort of thing, but you're right, there is a huge unmet need. And you folks have the opportunity of trying to solve that. Wish you the best.
What does professionalism mean to you, and why is it important?
Well, professionalism to me is, in a sense, an amorphous concept, except for the fact that as lawyers we have this perverse way of describing ethics. Because think about it, when you hear Professor Long talking about ethics, he is talking about the lowest level of conduct that you can keep your license, if you adhere to that. When he's talking with you about professionalism, he's talking about conduct several notches above that. It's got an aspirational aspect to it. Not what can we or can't we do, but what should we do? And that's the difference. What should we do as a professional as opposed to what we can do as a lawyer. The public gives us an oligopoly. They have the right to expect that we perform appropriately.
Jim, when you came to be the bar president, you came from a big firm, and that was not uncommon back then, but do you sense a shift in the attitudes of especially large firms to encourage their lawyers to become active in bar activities, especially to run for office? And if so, why?
Billable hours. We were better off as a profession when we weren't quite as interested in how much money we were making. And it's a vicious cycle because, let's face it, is you get more and more equity partners who, and you guys read the stats, some of whom even right close by in Atlanta, where an average, several firms have the average equity partner makes over $1 million a year. That is a huge business. Now, if you've got somebody who is one of those equity partners who all of a sudden wants to take off half to full time for 3 solid years, that's a lot of gross revenue. Are you willing to give it up? I don't think you see the same view that we are here, a part of what we need to do in addition to giving superb legal service to our clients is to help the community. And I really do believe, by the way, that bar work is certainly helped the profession, if not to the community in general. And I don't see that changing dramatically, Larry. I think it will be the unusual big firm lawyer who takes on this sort of task.
Yes, ma'am.
If you were a law student today, what steps would you take in preparing for this legal profession 20 years away?
Well, when I tell our students is, if you don't take every field placement opportunity, you are out of your mind. That you need to have some experience to look good on your CV when you're going out to recruit. So any opportunity you have, if that means, for instance, that between the first and second year, you've got the opportunity of having an unpaid internship with a Superior Court judge someplace in the state, with a district attorney someplace in the state, even though after the second year would be better there because they can use you better. Take those opportunities, and that's particularly true if you are a straight through, meaning you graduated from college in May and were starting law school in August. You really need to have some connection with the real world if you're going to look good to a hiring partner or the hiring lawyer in a governmental agency or at a in-house legal staff. They are looking for people who have experience, preferably legal experience, but just the fact that you have had some experience other than being a student. So whatever you can do to get that experience, do it. So as loud as you can.
You teach our generation. What do you think our strengths are as they relate to the practice of law? And what are the greatest challenges for our generation as we enter the practice?
All right, so you're about to get me in trouble.
Right. You don't think generations are different, do you?
Whew. I'll start off with a couple of zingers, give you a couple of examples, and also suggest to you that's one of the reasons I like people I have experience in between college and law school.
And then you're going to say something positive.
Hopefully, yes. The word entitlement, I think, is how I think of folks who are coming along now. Is that your fault? Is that your parents' fault? Is there a combination? But I really see it in our students that they believe they are there. For instance, having one of our Woodruff scholars, they get full tuition and a stipend, say to me when I had suggested that they fill out a pledge card for when they graduated, why? And I said, well, for one reason, consider the fact that you have spent 3 years here with somebody else picking up the tab. You know what the response was? I was entitled to that. Which, for an old guy like me, just shocks the hell out of me hearing. The other things that you may find interesting, I've only had it happen once, but a number of my colleagues have had it happen, to have parents call to talk about their students' grades. You folks are in law school. If you were in the 8th grade, I can sort of understand that. Having helicopter mom pick up the phone and ask, why did Sally get a B instead of an A? I was not totally cordial. And to give you a second example, someone who was called up before the Character and Fitness Board for the State Bar, which all of you will get the opportunity to fill out this absolutely comprehensive questionnaire asking you questions you really don't want to have to answer, but you will have to answer them to do that. In any event, this person was called in to explain to the fitness board why there were mistakes on the application. The response was, it wasn't my fault. My mom filled it out, and I guess she just didn't know. I will assure you that would not have happened 10 years or so ago. I wish that I could talk our faculty into doing what I think Northwestern does, and that is require that all of our applicants have been out of school for at least 2 years before they applied to come to law school. My experience is purely anecdotal. I can almost always pick out the ones who have spent some time before they come back to law school. They are focused, and it doesn't really matter. Did they spend 2 years in the Peace Corps living in a mud hut in Central Africa? Did they work as a teller at the SunTrust Bank? The fact that they were out on their own, having to make rent payments, and live brings a marked short-term increase in maturity. Then I have a politically incorrect way of phrasing it is that I think there is a difference in the whine factor. Straight-throughs are much more likely to say, that's not fair. Somebody who's been out for 3 years, I'm at point A, I want to go to point B, don't bother me about what's not fair. In terms of our own students, and I am absolutely sure they apply here too, they are brighter. Many of them are motivated by what I consider to be the right reasons to go into a service profession. That's why we owe to you the best education we can possibly give you, to give you the quickest opportunity to become that consummate professional. And do, by the way, go pick out some role models, some mentors. And as Pat's already pointed out, they don't have to be in your firm. They can be other lawyers that simply perform at a level of professional conduct that you think, that's what I want to be. So watch for those folks and try to emulate what they do. You've got a great opportunity. You just need to take advantage of it.
Well, Jim, on that note, I think we need to close. We've used our time together, but thank you for taking the time to be with us. And
Thanks
just
for
share all
letting me
that-
be here.
Thank you.